Welcome to our introduction to Kill a Mockingbird. I'm really excited to do this novel with you guys. It is not the way that I had planned it, but it is my goal to do this novel justice, e-learning style. Today we are just going to talk about some important background information to Kill a Mockingbird. The first thing that I wanted to point out to you is that this book is narrated by Scout, a 6-year-old girl. Scout is someone that I have a love-hate relationship with. She is someone that can really get under your skin because she is fearless and she is overly confident and she can be really sassy. But she is also someone that you can kind of learn to love because she embodies what it means to be brave, and she is someone who pushes the envelope sometimes in a very positive way. Scout lives with her older brother Jem and her father Atticus Finch, who is one of the most beloved characters in all of American literature. And he is so beloved because he truly embodies what it means to be a kind-hearted and generous person. To Kill a Mockingbird is divided up into two parts, book 1 and book 2. In book 1, it is full of exposition and rising action. We get some really essential background information about our characters. There is a lot of character development in book 1, and all of that builds up and leads to our climax in book 2. Book 2 is very different from book 1 because book 2 does not necessarily focus on our characters and getting to know them. It really focuses on a trial that is going to take place. Atticus Finch is actually a lawyer, and he makes some very compelling arguments in a trial where he defends a man named Tom Robinson, who has been accused of raping a white girl. Now, with that said, this novel does contain some very sensitive and heavy content. We are going to be talking about some controversial things that are going to need to be dealt with in a very delicate manner. We are also going to see some very aggressive language used within this text. The setting of To Kill a Mockingbird takes place in the fictional town of Macomb, Alabama. It takes place during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, during a time of great racial turmoil. We really need to look at things through a historical lens. So we're going to be talking about the racial segregation that happened in the Deep South in the 1930s. After the Civil War, blacks were considered free, but they didn't have the same rights as whites. There was a significant amount of racial tension, particularly in states like Alabama. And because of that racial tension, lynching was something that was very common in the South. We saw a lot of whites with racist tendencies, and we also saw a lot of hostility between blacks and whites, particularly because of something called Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws is what led to that widespread segregation in the South, which ensured that blacks and whites were really kept truly separate, whether it was at drinking fountains, at stores, at school, at church. Those were all things that were segregated. Now, with these Jim Crow laws, it's not only important to understand what they are, but it's also important to understand where they originated. Now, these Jim Crow laws started after the Civil War, but their origins actually date back to prior to the Civil War. Now, with Jim Crow laws, they were actually enacted from the late 1800s all the way through the late 1960s during the height of the Civil Rights Movement. So these Jim Crow laws were around for an extended period of time. And these laws brought legal punishments, sometimes often harsh punishments that were imposed on people for maybe having contact with members of another race or stepping into a facility that was segregated. These laws were legal in these states, and the 10th Amendment actually allowed for these laws to be created. we saw Jim Crow laws predominantly in the South. In the North or in California, these laws were not in place. Now, these laws had a really significant impact on African Americans during this time. And not only were the laws themselves very harsh and restricting, but the name Jim Crow is actually really offensive and very derogatory and hurtful toward African Americans. And I think it's important to understand where these laws come from, especially given the context of our novel. Now, I want to talk to you guys a little bit about where that term Jim Crow comes from. So the term Jim Crow actually originated from somebody named T.D. Rice. And he was somebody who would dress up in blackface and perform in a minstrel show or a music show. And T.D. Rice actually became really well known for dressing up in blackface and essentially going on stage and singing songs and acting in a way that made fun of and mocked slaves. So T.D. Rice actually started these shows in 1828 prior to the Civil War. And you can see in these pictures what it looked like and how truly offensive and racist it was. And the sad part about this is that T.D. Rice actually made a lot of money off of these shows. He toured all across the United States. He even toured in England. And this was something that was really popular amongst whites. And the name Jim Crow itself is actually really offensive too. So to give you a little bit of history behind this, the idea of Jim came from the word Jimmy, which was kind of like slang for a crowbar. And that also kind of gives us the crow part of Jim Crow, but the crow part also comes from the word crow, which was a derogatory name that a lot of whites used dating back all the way to the 1700s as an offensive term for blacks. So essentially what would happen is that farmers fed crows corn that was soaked in whiskey, and they would get the crows drunk, and the crows would kind of like waddle around and stumble around, and they would use crowbars to beat them to death. So that's where our name Jim Crow comes from. And essentially we have it as a name that was meant to beat down or oppress blacks when we look at the history and how it is connected back to crows on farms. So that kind of gives you a sense of where these laws came from and just kind of how truly hurtful they were meant to be. And we are going to see these laws in full force as we read To Kill a Mockingbird. So this is the end of part 1 of our introduction to Kill a Mockingbird. We will continue the rest on Monday. I wanted to let you know that in your calendar I have put a link to a virtual tour of the Jim Crow Museum where you can do a virtual walkthrough and take a look at some historical artifacts from the Jim Crow era.